Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network. Any opinions or comments made by any guest are their own, and they do not necessarily reflect any of the presenters or network's opinions.
Hello, this is Michael Feely, and you're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, the UK's biggest paranormal network, and this is Paranormal Dimensions with David Young.
Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you for the introduction, Michael. Once again, as always, thank you for the emails that you send me. I have to say that most of the emails that I get are just emails that say thank you, the listeners enjoy the show, etc. Of course, if you have any complaints or if you'd like to make any other comments, hopefully I don't get too many of those, you'd like to get in touch with me at any time. My email address is davidyoung2qn@yahoo.co.uk. That's davidyoung2qn@yahoo.co.uk. Okay, today's guest is Graham Phillips. He's investigated unsolved mysteries for many years. In the 1980s, with Martin Keatman, he co-authored The Green Stone. It's a book I'm actually reading at the moment, and The Eye of Fire, which documented the discovery of the Marion Stone hidden after the gunpowder plot of 1605, and the Ranton Bell, now in the hands of the Queen's cousin Lord Lichfield. Graham Phillips has lectured on many media studies at Cambridge, Brunel and Warwick universities, and previously worked as a magazine editor, programme presenter with the BBC. So, now I'd like to introduce Mr. Graham Phillips. Now, just before Graham comes on, you will note after about an hour there's a glitch in the show. It will become obvious when it happens, and you'll hear back from me at that point. But before then, please enjoy Graham's talk. It's very, very interesting, and you'll hear from me in about an hour again when this glitch happens. Okay? Mr. Graham Phillips. Hello, Graham. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on.
It's a great pleasure to have you on, and as you know, we've tried to get this off the ground for probably a few weeks now, a couple of months, probably a month or so at least. We've finally got the propeller spinning, and we're off.
Indeed, well, there's technical problems, my illness for a couple of weeks, and we've got together at last.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a bit of a doozy, isn't it, trying to get it going? But anyway, here we are, and it's great to have you on, Graham. I had your very good friend Andrew Collins on show number 100 at the beginning of the year.
Oh, wow.
And I know you had several adventures together. And really, I'd like to talk about your life, really, over the years, the books you've written, the adventures you've been on. I'm actually reading The Green Stone at the moment. I'm at the point where you're at the lake and in the dead of night.
Well, it's a good point to start, really, because The Green Stone was the first book that I wrote, and it involved myself and Andrew Collins, as you mentioned. And this is how it started for me, because I'd been to college and studied journalism, and I eventually ended up editing a magazine called Strange Phenomena that was based in Wolverhampton. And one of the people who worked on the magazine part-time was Andrew Collins. And he and I, it was really meant to be investigating paranormal and UFOs and things like that, but we kind of started to investigate a few historical mysteries, and one of them was concerning this green stone gemstone that had once belonged to Mary Queen of Scots, and it had been on her ring. And after she died, because she was a Catholic martyr, a lot of her possessions became sought after relics by the Catholics of England, who were being really quite persecuted under the Protestant regime of Queen Elizabeth I. And so this particular green stone was considered of importance. It was supposed to hold mystical powers, and so the Catholic Church wanted it, the Protestant Church wanted it, and it kind of like somehow disappeared before she was executed in the late 1500s. And there was a legend that survived that it was that one of the Catholics, who was her sympathiser, hid it after the gunpowder plot of 1605, in the Guy Fawkes plot that people know about. That was another attempt that the Catholics had of trying to bring down the Protestant regime that was persecuting them. And the stone was supposedly hidden after the gunpowder plot, but by one of the sympathizers with the plot and with Mary Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic herself, of course, a man called Humphrey Packington, who lived at a place called Harvington Hall, an old Elizabethan manor, where we had the magazine based. So we decided, let's see if we can. Supposedly there was left in his old Elizabethan house as to where this green stone was hidden. So Andrew and I decided to see if we went to this house, see if we could discover these clues and see if we could unravel this story, and maybe even find this green stone that Mary Queen of Scots had. As part, it's an interesting story for the magazine, and that's how it all got going.
Yeah, so I'm quite intrigued as to where it's leading. So you're at the lake in the dead of night, wondering if someone's going to catch you. So I won't ask you to give it away, but it's quite intriguing.
Well, I can basically.
Sorry.
I can actually give away what got us to actually as far as the lake that you're talking about. We did in fact find, when we got to Harvington Hall, that in the not too recent past, this was all happening in 1979, so sometime in the 1970s, during renovations to this old building to open it to the public, a series of paintings or murals, wall murals, had been found behind wood panelling in an upstairs corridor. And it consisted of a painting of 9 heroic characters from myth and legend and from history, and it was called the Nine Werthers. It was seemingly commissioned by Humphrey Packington himself, but then in 1606, right after he'd had these paintings done, they'd been sealed up behind the wood panelling by him. So if anything was likely to be the clues as to where this stone was hidden, it was in these paintings. And it took some time, but we eventually figured out that as the central figure of these murals was a youthful King Arthur wielding Excalibur, we kind of thought, well, maybe that is something to do with it, because one of the myths was that this green stone was once set in the hilt of King Arthur's sword Excalibur. Now, whether that was true or not, it was certainly part of the mythology behind the stone. So we thought this could be why King Arthur is depicted in this mural. And in the mural, he's standing with his back to a hill upon which his knights are gathered. And cutting a long story short, we discovered that very close to Harvington Hall in the Worcestershire countryside, there was a lake right below a hill called Knight's Hill. Knights, like Knights of the Round Table, gathered on this hill, so we thought that might be important. And then when we discovered that this bridge was actually called Arthur's Bridge, then, well, there's no doubt that we thought that it might be in the foundation stones of this old Elizabethan bridge that this stone was hidden. And that's kind of where you've got to in the book.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, because Andrew finds a sword of some kind, doesn't he?
Yeah, what had happened, and this is where some kind of psychic bits and pieces start coming into it. Until this point, we're basically investigating historical mystery and physical clues left. But one or two of the people involved with the Strange Phenomena magazine started to have dreams about a sword that they believed had sort of been hidden somewhere as part of a series of clues to lead to where this stone was hidden. And they started to say, I mean, two or three people quite separately from each other had dreams or visions, if you like, that there was a sword involved and that the sword would somehow lead us to find the stone. And so when we actually got to, just before we went to this pool, this lake where this bridge was, one of these people, a guy called Alan Beard, phoned us up to tell us that you're actually looking for a sword at this point. You're not looking for a stone, and the sword will lead you to the stone. So we kind of, when we got to that bridge, we thought, well, it's got to be, if Alan Beard's right, and these other people are right about a sword being involved, then maybe we're looking for a sword hidden in this bridge. But if there was a sword hidden in the bridge, whereabouts? And on the bridge, the Arthur figure is like looking down and to his left. And if you stood on the bridge with the Knight's Hill behind you in the same position as the hill with the knights on it in the Nine Werthers paintings at Harvington Hall, and sort of stood where Arthur's standing with the hill over to your left-hand shoulder, and you look down to your left, then that took you to the foundations of the bridge overlooking the lake where this stream came into the lake, but overlooking the lake on the right-hand side, if you like, as seen from the lake. So we went, I mean, basically it was Andy who clambered down into the foundations of that part of the bridge, and it was all literally overgrown and smelling of rotting vegetation, and the thing was covered in brambles. I mean, it hadn't been uncovered for years. And eventually when we pulled her out these brambles and got to the position where the foundations were, we thought, well, which stone, we have to pull the whole lot down. But because the paintings were called the Nine Werthers, we thought that maybe it's 9 across and 9 down. If you tried 9 across and 9 up, you'd be right at the top of the bridge, and that wouldn't make any sense. So we thought 9 down. We got this stone out eventually, and we had to took some doing. And behind it, we just couldn't believe our eyes when we found there was some long, thin object behind this big stone in a recess, and it was heavily covered in silt and sediment. And when we took it out, you could see that it was either a long dagger or a short sword, and it must have been hidden there for years.
Where is it now? Is it still in your possession?
Andy's got it. It's in here. No, hold on. Wait, hold on. I'm getting confused here. I'm thinking of something else here. No, right. Okay. This is what happened to the sword when we found it. It was cleaned up by the Chester Museum. The Chester Museum was, the Grosvenor Museum in Chester had an interest in things of the period we were dealing with, the early 1600s. They identified the sword as a short Scottish sword called a dirk. It's mainly a ceremonial sword, and this had upon it the coat of arms of the very person that we had been told had once possessed the sword, Mary Queen of Scots. And it had the words written across it, Mia Naya for Mary. And we'd been told earlier on in our investigations that the stone had been called the Mia Naya stone. So there was something directly linking this sword. It wasn't we'd found some kind of mason's mark hidden in the brickwork. This was directly connected with this whole series of clues we were following. And eventually this sword did lead us to discover the green stone. I won't give the whole story away. That's, because otherwise there's no point in reading the book.
Well, spoil it for me, and then anyone else who wants to get the book after hearing this as well, so.
Yeah, so basically that provided a new series of clues. But the sword itself, we discovered it on land that had once belonged to the Earl of Coventry. although Coventry's quite a distance away, he was the Earl of it. Now, the building, Croom Court, that owned the estate, massive, great Georgian mansion house, at that point was owned by the Hare Krishna movement, and it was their kind of headquarters for Britain. We went to see them and said, look, we found this sword in this old, this old bridge that's on your land. We thought we'd better let you know or have it. They were fascinated, but they had no interest in it. They said, well, you can keep it. So we did for a while, but then one day, Andrew Collins decided to write to the Earl of Coventry to find out from him exactly if his family knew anything about this bridge or anything else. But he got a reply from and he told him that we'd found this sword in the bridge, and his estate manager at the time was not happy that we'd pulled apart his bridge to find this sword, and said, if it's not returned to us, we're going to sue you, or involve the police for criminal damage. And we said, well, we haven't done that much. Give us the sword, or that's it. So the sword was given to the Earl of Coventry. We never heard anything from him about it, but evidently, and this is the bit that sort of, that really I never knew about until quite recently. The Earl of Coventry gave the sword, was fascinated by the story. It was his agent that was, was more annoyed with us. The Earl himself at the time thought, this is, great. So he donated it to a museum nearby at a place called the Tudor House Museum in Upton upon Severn, which is in Worcestershire. And it's been on display there ever since. And in the last couple of years, since we brought out the 40th anniversary edition of the Greenstone, which was basically, it's this original story. I didn't change the wording or anything. But it's gotten some new pictures and stuff. To commemorate that, the people at the museum decided to install a proper display case and all the information about that sword and how it was found. And it's still now there as a public exhibit at the Tudor House Museum in Upton upon Severn.
Fascinating. I think one of the most fascinating facts of this is the psychic messages that were coming through in order to find this sword. That's what fascinates me,
Yeah, that was totally unexpected. We started to get people getting these dreams and things about, the sword and where it was and other clues as we went along. I mean, we could have solved it with just solving the clues from the murals, the paintings, and then after we found the sword. But what was happening is that there's a woman called Marion, for example, who was involved in the magazine, and she was like a contributor to it, but she'd never actually had anything psychic happen to her before. But she fell asleep in her armchair while watching the television late one night, and then had this dream about this avenue of trees and this meander in a river, and what she dreamt was the exact location, exactly what it looked like, where the stone was eventually found. Alan Beard, for example, the one who told us about this, we were looking for a sword that night and it would be in the bridge, said that he dreamt that a holly bush was over where the sword was. And when Andy and I found it, we looked up, there was a holly bush right there. So how people were getting these messages, I have absolutely no idea.
It's absolute solid.
Where they were coming from.
Yeah, as I say, it's absolute solid evidence of some kind of paranormal occurrence there, isn't there?
Well, there's just the sheer numbers of people involved. But I mean, once we actually found the Greenstone, the weird things that happened in the Oaks Crescent, what was Oaks Crescent, 19 Oaks Crescent in Wolverhampton was where the headquarters of the magazine was. The offices, and it was just an ordinary offices of a magazine. There was about 20 people working there, on and off. It was like an old Victorian house. A lot of it was sort of, a bit sort of dilapidated, but it served as okay as an offices in a few of the rooms. But the weird things that started to happen there once we'd found this greenstone and taken it back to the headquarters, the offices, was I've never known anything like it. I mean, smoke filled the whole place from nowhere. I mean, all the rooms, even behind doors and in closets, and no one could figure out where it was coming from. It happened every night for about a week at around 5 o'clock as it was getting dark. They even had a film crew from the BBC come along and film this happening, and no one could explain where it was coming from. They couldn't. The electricity company came. They couldn't find anything wrong with the wiring. We had the fire service coming. They could find nothing wrong. Weird things like this started happening. So it wasn't just the dreams and visions of people. It was also physical phenomena like that. Why, how, I don't know.
Very strange. Now, are you actually psychic yourself, Graham, or have you got any sort of abilities like that, or?
Not really. I mean, things have happened. I've witnessed things happening over the years. But I wouldn't class myself as psychic. A lot of synchronicities happen to me. I mean, I might be sort of investigating something, and then suddenly somebody just gets in touch at exactly the right time with the right kind of information.
Yeah.
You know,
I think we've all been there. I've had things like that too.
I'm not somebody who goes around reading people's minds or anything.
No. I mean, also, I think the thing that fascinates me about this is the King Arthur connection. It seems to suggest that there was definitely a King Arthur. I don't know. What is your opinion of that?
Well, this after the magazine eventually ceased publication, and I decided to start. I mean, I decided to write a book after the magazine had ceased. I decided to write the book about the Greenstone, but because it involved this King Arthur side, I thought, well, this stone was supposed to have been set in Excalibur. I mean, did Excalibur even exist at all? I mean, did King Arthur even exist? So it kind of got me interested in King Arthur, but because there was nothing psychic involved in all this, and this was something I was simply investigating on my own, it was a purely historical investigation. I mean, I was no historian, certainly not back then. But I thought, well, I'll do some research and see what I can find out about Arthur. I mean, did he really exist, or is he simply a legend? Well, obviously the King Arthur we all know and love is this character that fights dragons, rescues damsels in distress, and so forth. Well, obviously that is a medieval invention, but the earliest writings about Arthur in the Middle Ages that were written in the 1100s say that they're basing their stories, their novels, if you like, of the time, their romances, on a historical figure who really did exist around the year 500 AD, shortly after the Roman Empire had collapsed. Now, there are earlier references to Arthur that do exist. There's one from around about 800 by a British monk called Nennius, who talks about King Arthur simply as an historical figure who lived around the year 500. He fought a series of successful battles against the invading Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons originally came from Germany and invaded Celtic Britain, which had been ruled by the Romans for years. The Romans had pulled out, left this country open for invasion by the Anglo-Saxons, and Arthur, it is said by this monk Nennius, was one of the last British heroes to unite the British separate tribes to fight off the Anglo-Saxons. And once he died, the Anglo-Saxons started to push and eventually took over what's now England. So he writes about Arthur without anything to do with myths and legends and dragons or anything else. He is simply an historical figure. And there are other early references to Arthur that he fought a battle here or there, but have him in an historical context. The problem is that I found when I investigated it is in the year 500, the records that exist from then don't mention Arthur at all. But they do, another monk, they were the only people who were literate at the time after the Roman Empire had collapsed. It was a period called the Dark Ages, of which basically society collapsed, and the only people who could read or write or kept records were the church, really. There was no real civil authorities. Everybody went back to feuding, almost Iron Age kingdoms. But this monk called Gildas, writing within living memory of the year 500, when Arthur's supposed to have lived, talks about a figure that united the British against the Anglo-Saxons, but he calls him Ursus. That's Latin. He was writing in Latin. The bear. Now, this is clearly some sort of nickname, or let's call it a kind of epithet, some sort of battle name. A lot of Celtic warriors had the name of the fox, for example, if they were cunning, or the hawk, or whatever. They were named after animals. It was an honorific title. And so this person, the bear, well, when I realised that in Brythonic, which was the language spoken by the British, the ordinary British people, at the time that Arthur is said to have lived, the word for a bear is Arth, and the bear is Arthur. So basically, and in fact, even in modern Welsh, which derived from Brythonic, Arth or Earth, A-R-T-H, still means bear. So, in other words, I had found reference to a person who'd united the British kings, a powerful British king, whose name was Arthur, but that was his title, not his real name, which may have explained why nobody had ever found him.
That's quite fascinating. Very much so. Because, I mean, obviously, from the paranormal viewpoint, Arthur had sidekicks, if you like to call them, like Merlin, and also has Knights of the Round Table. Is there any evidence of Knights of the Round Table, etc., and Merlin?
Well, yes. The interesting parts about all this is that a lot of these myths and legends about Arthur probably came about through historical traditions. For example, the story of Arthur gaining the sword, the magical sword Excalibur, from the Lady of the Lake, and then everybody knows the story about when he's dying, he asks one of his knights, Sir Bedivere, to throw the sword into a nearby lake, where the arm of the Lady of the Lake, this mysterious water nymph, grabs the weapon by the hilt and takes it down into the crystal depths. Well, that all sounds totally made up, but there was a tradition around the time that Arthur is said to have lived amongst Celtic chieftains that during their funerals, their prized possessions, such as their swords, were thrown into a sacred lake as an offering to a water deity, a goddess. So this may have actually, and in fact, archaeologists have discovered many of these swords that had once been thrown into lakes and in the beds of dried up lakes. So we know this happens. We've got records from the time saying that this is what the Celts did. So, in other words, this tradition of Arthur dying and his sword being thrown to a water goddess could have eventually become the story of the sword being thrown to the Lady of the Lake. Now, in the same way, the idea of the Knights of the Round Table, all these people sitting in a big circle so that none could be above the other, they were all equal, is another Celtic practice that when there was a meeting of a alliance of tribal chieftains, they would all sit in a circle around a sacred stone or sometimes cauldron. And it could be from this that the idea of the Knights of the Round Table came. And you talked about Merlin. There is actual historical evidence that a man by the name of Ambrosius Aurelius had the title Merlin. Merlin actually was an old Brythonic word for an eagle. There's actually still a small bird of prey today called a merlin. And this man called Ambrosius Aurelius, he is spoken about in the writings of this monk called Nennius, I mentioned before. He refers to him having a vision of two dragons, and these two dragons fight each other, and this symbolises to Ambrosius Aurelius that soon the Anglo-Saxons will invade, and he tells a king called Vortigern all about this, and Vortigern appoints him as his court advisor, and then one of Vortigern's successors is Arthur, and that's how come Merlin comes to advise Arthur. Now, that's how come in his version of stories, Ambrosius Aurelius comes to advise Arthur. But in a later story that was popularised by a man called Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 1100s, he tells exactly this same story, but other than Ambrosius Aurelius, he says that the person who has this vision of the two dragons is Merlin. And then later in this same book, the History of the Kings of Britain, written by Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1133, he tells us that Merlin's original name was Ambrosius. Now, so there's this character called Ambrosius who's got a title called Merlin, who has this dream about dragons, who he then interprets and advises for a king called Vortigern that the Saxons will invade, and because he impresses the king and helps him, he becomes the royal advisor, and he later is to Arthur. Does this Ambrosius Aurelius really exist? Yes. Roman records of the end of the 400s refer to him being a major character in the last days of the Roman Empire in Britain. He is one of the last Roman commanders of Britain, who apparently, after he retired, became something of a mystic. So yes, Merlin really existed, and he did exist at the time that Arthur is said to have been.
Fascinating. Because when I don't know, like you, I remember one of the first TV programs that I remember was a program called Sir Lancelot. We're going back into the sort of the late 50s with William Russell, and of course that
the guy was first Doctor Who's.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct.
Yeah, he was one of the Doctor Who's first.
That's right. Yeah, it goes right. Oh, it shows you how old I am as well. But
old I am.
But I can remember it because they kind of show it as in the Middle Ages, don't they? So really, Arthur was way before that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about why is Arthur always shown in the Middle Ages? I mean, if you've seen the film Excalibur, that shows Arthur with knights in shining armour and all the rest of it, living in a huge Gothic castle. This is because when these romances of Arthur, these fictional stories about Arthur were written, it was a time of knights in shining armour and huge Gothic castles. And when medieval, that's the period of castles and knights in shining armour, when medieval authors or artists tried to depict historical scenes like ancient Greece or Rome, they had no idea what ancient Romans or Greeks looked like. So all they had was the writings that had survived from these times. And so when they actually depicted them, let's say in paintings, they showed them in contemporary clothing like armour, shining armour. So if you look at medieval paintings of the crucifixion of Jesus, for example, you will see the Roman soldiers at the foot of the cross, not dressed like Roman soldiers, but in armour and things of the Middle Ages. This is because it was only relatively recently, because of archaeology, I say relatively recently, over the last few hundred years, because of archaeology and the opening up of more people who are able to read and look at documentation from Roman times, that people actually began to know what Romans had looked like. So when the same thing happens in art, they didn't know what people at the end of the Roman Empire, how they would have dressed. In fact, the historical Arthur would have dressed more like a Roman soldier, probably in tatty Roman armour that was left over from the Roman Empire, and he would have not lived in a huge stone Gothic castle, but he would have lived in something like a Roman-style villa surrounded by wooden stockades and earthen embankments. That would have been their defences. So the historical Arthur is like a Roman, if you like. You could probably call him, and he is in fact described in some of the earliest references to him, as the last of the Romans. He's probably the last person to actually use Roman fighting techniques against the invaders of Britain until the place was overtaken by the Anglo-Saxons.
Definitely. I mean, that kind of leads me on to, you did some studies into Robin Hood. I know this is not like a paranormal viewpoint, but Robin Hood, do you think Robin Hood existed too? I know you did quite a bit of a study into it.
Yeah, well, I didn't to start off with. I thought, well, he's got to have been made up. I mean, nobody goes around robbing the rich and giving it to the poor, you know? And all these merry men, they're starving to death in Sherwood Forest. And the Middle Ages was a hideous time. People were dying of the plague. There was,
it's even worse than it is today.
I mean, that's the Roman Empire.
It's even worse than it is today.
I mean, I think the Black Death wiped out about half of Europe's population. Yeah. But anyway, so I didn't, but I thought, well, it's worth investigating. My publisher at the time, after I'd written Arthur sometime later, he said, well, write a book about Robin Hood, He's another character that everybody's interested in. I looked into it, and what I found was fascinating. Whereas no one seemed to have really found an historical King Arthur, because that wasn't his name, but his title. And in fact, when I looked into the historical references at the British Library as to who this man who was known as the Bear was, I found his real name was Owen Llangwyn, which means Owen Whitetooth. That's basically was his family name, like Native Americans have got sort of names that associate them with their parents. And his father was known as like the Whitetooth. So he's Owen, son of Whitetooth. That was his real name. But anyway, in the same way as maybe people hadn't been able to discover who this historical Arthur really was and doubted him because they were looking for a man whose name was Arthur, not his title, the Bear. In the case of Robin Hood, it suddenly turned out that people were looking in the wrong historical time period. Because the Robin Hood story we know today actually comes from a contemporary playwright to William Shakespeare, a man called Anthony Munday, who was writing in the late 1500s, the same time as William Shakespeare. In fact, William Shakespeare and he seem to have collaborated on a play together at one point. So this playwright wrote a play about Robin Hood, about him being a disinherited earl who'd fled to Sherwood Forest, was sought by the sheriff of Nottingham, robbed from the rich, gave to the poor, had lots of merry men, married Maid Marian, all that stuff. But that's the invention, pretty much, of this playwright in the late 1500s. And he places all this action during the period when Richard the Lionheart, King Richard I, was absent on the Third Crusade in the 1190s, and he'd left his brother, Prince John, to rule the country in his stead, and Prince John had put the evil Sheriff of Nottingham in charge of the whole of Sherwood Forest in the centre of England, and then their story begins. Well, this is true. King Richard had gone on a crusade. He had left his brother, John, to govern the country, who made a complete mess of it. But everybody who'd sought to find any historical records of a Robin Hood who may have been outlawed, but, maybe he'd sort of robbed the rich, maybe he hadn't got round to giving it to the poor, but was there a Robin Hood who was a notorious outlaw? And they hadn't found any record of it. But I decided to try and find what's the earliest story of Robin Hood, not the poem, not the play that was written by Anthony Munday in Shakespeare's time, but the earliest story that's known comes from around 1400. That's pretty much a couple of hundred years before Anthony Munday's version, and it's called The Little Guest of Robin Hood. It still survives in copies in the British Library. There are earlier references to Robin Hood, but no full story. But what's interesting about the story of Robin Hood in this original, which is actually a ballad rather than a play, it refers to Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest. It refers to the Sheriff of Nottingham. He's got his band of followers, although they're not that merry. He does rob from the rich. Sometimes he gets round to giving it to the poor. But the most interesting thing is, firstly, it's not set at the time of Richard I in the 1190s. It actually tells us that the king involved is a King Edward. And he tells us things that this King Edward does. And the only Edward that fits with this is Edward II and things he's doing in the early 1320s. So it could be that the Robin Hood that Anthony Munday decided to say, he was doing all this stuff at the time of Richard the Lionheart, was completely wrong. It was happening at the time of Edward II. So then I started to look in a different time period. Also, Robin seems to come from a completely different area. Although he ends up in Nottingham and that area around Sherwood Forest, he's born and brought up and is outlawed in Yorkshire in a town called Wakefield, which is about 50 miles north of Nottingham. So I look in the records of Wakefield for around the year, the early 1320s, and I find that there is a Robin Hood, or at least Robert Hode. Robin is a nickname for Robert, and H-O-D is the way of spelling Hood. In the Middle Ages, there was no consistency of spelling. So for all intents and purposes, there is a Robin Hood who's outlawed in Wakefield at exactly the right time. And what makes it really interesting is if all the stories of Robin Hood, you've always got this massive rivalry between the Sheriff of Nottingham and Robin Hood, and you don't really know what's behind it all. Why do they hate each other so much right from the beginning? Well, it turns out that both this Robert Hood, who was outlawed for rustling, if you like, stealing cattle and things, he was actually involved in doing this with a man called Henry de Fakenbury. And Henry de Fakenbury was richer than Robin, but they were both seemingly friends who were involved in all sorts of criminal activities together. Robin then runs into Sherwood Forest. Henry de Fakenbury gets out of being outlawed by enlisting into the guard of the local lord, the Earl of Lancaster, and eventually rises to become Sheriff of Nottingham. So the two men who were once friends as young men, and one becomes the outlaw, the other becomes the sheriff who's after him. Henry de Fakenbury, the very same man, and all these records exist. And I've had them filmed for television documentaries and so forth. They all exist at the archaeological archives of the University of Leeds. They're there for anyone to see. The original manor rolls, as they're called, sort of scrolls, records of Wakefield Manor show that this Robin Hood did exist and that he was a friend and associate of the person, Henry de Fakenbury, who became the Sheriff of Nottingham. So I pretty much found it.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. I know we're sort of branching off a little bit from the paranormal, but when you go for like King Arthur, you got like a paranormal connection. But then a lot of these legends, they've got a kind of a paranormal ring to them, haven't they? I guess anything that's sort of a mystery becomes a paranormal. But I know you've done a lot of research also into the Holy Grail, the search for the Holy Grail.
Yeah, again, the Holy Grail, what people have, everybody sort of tended to think that until the Dan Brown novels pretty much, that the Holy Grail was thought to be in the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper. And somehow one of his followers, Joseph of Arimathea, got hold of this cup and used it to collect a few drops of Christ's blood while he was on the cross, and this cup was then imbued with supernatural healing properties. You drank from it and you could either gain immortality or be cured from any illness. And this was then eventually brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea when he was escaping the persecutions of the Roman Empire, of the Christians. And Britain at that point, until, the time Jesus died, was still outside the Roman Empire. The Romans didn't conquer Britain for another couple of decades. And it was a safe haven. And a lot of Christians did actually, or a lot of followers of either Jewish religion that was being persecuted too, or early Christians, do seem to have come to Britain. So Joseph of Arimathea comes here, and he brings this cup with him, and it's hidden, and it's later sought by King Arthur and his knights once that King Arthur falls ill. And with Arthur ill, the country's being invaded, and they need to cure Arthur, and Merlin tells the knights that you must go and seek the Holy Grail. When eventually they find it, it turns out to be this amazing sort of gold jewel-encrusted chalice, which is unlikely to have been what Jesus used as a humble carpenter at the Last Supper, just before he was executed. But anyway, this is the story. But what's interesting is when you look back at the actual original source material of all these stories, these medieval romances about Arthur and the knight searching for the Grail, it's not in the original stories this cup of Jesus at the Last Supper at all. In one of the stories, written by a French poet called Chrétien de Troyes around 1190, it's a plate or platter which holds a mass wafer. Then in another story by a German poet called Wolfgang von Eckenbach, who wrote a story, Parsifal, which is all about Sir Percival finding the Grail. When he finds it, the Grail is guarded by the Knights Templar, and it's a green stone, a gemstone. And at one point we wondered whether this stone that we'd found, the Mary Queen of Scots stone, was one and the same thing. But I tried to trace back. I mean, it wasn't until about 1120 that a Burgundian French poet by the name of Robert de Baron decided to make the Holy Grail become the cup of the Last Supper. But he didn't invent the idea of somebody using a vessel to collect drops of Christ's blood. In the earliest stories of the Holy Grail, the Grail is said to be a cup used, a small vessel used by Jesus' female disciple or follower, Mary Magdalene, and she is said to have collected a few drops of Christ's blood while he was on the cross in this small perfume jar that she had. And it was this that became the Grail in the original stories. She brought it to Britain when she fled the persecutions of the Romans. Now, that was the early story told in the Dark Ages. Once you got into the Middle Ages, people became very sort of misogynistic, and having females being of importance in story was not on. If you wanted your story to sell, so to speak, you wouldn't have a female hero. So they took Mary Magdalene out of it and brought in Joseph of Arimathea and took away Mary Magdalene. I mean, he wouldn't have a perfume jar. Why would he have one? So they changed it to being Jesus' cup at the Last Supper or other items. But so I thought, well, if I'm going to try and find the story behind the original Holy Grail, or find anything to do with it, or whether it really existed or not, I've got to look for this Mary Magdalene's cup, which is also known as the Chalice of Magdalene, or the Marion Chalice. And if you look at any picture of Mary Magdalene painted during the Middle Ages or until relatively recently, you always see her depicted with this small cup. Sometimes it's made into a larger gold jewel-encrusted chalice, but that's just, artist's impressions. Most of the earlier pictures depict it as a small, rather plain-looking Roman-style scent jar. Now, according to the earliest stories of the Grail is always hidden in the same place. Whatever it is, it's always hidden in a place called the White Castle in the White Town. Now, there was a place in Britain known as the White Town. It still exists, and it's called Whittington, derived from the Old English White Town. And in the White Town in Whittington, there is a castle dating from the Middle Ages, which is known locally as the White Castle because it's made from light-coloured limestone. And it's Whittington Castle where, interestingly, there really was somebody in the Middle Ages who claimed to have had the Grail. A man called Fulk Fitzwarine, who was an earl around the year 1200. And in a story about Fulk Fitzwarine, that was written by one of his scribes that was trying to promote his earl as being some great superhero fighting in the Crusades, a lot of earls and lords had people writing either truthful or fictitious stories about their deeds in the Crusades. But they actually have Fulk Fitzwarine possessing this Holy Grail, finding the Holy Grail, bringing it back from the Middle East, having it at his home at Whittington Castle, and keeping it in a sacred chapel. But interestingly, the Grail that they say he possessed isn't the cup of the Last Supper, but this small scent jar that belonged to Mary Magdalene. So I thought, wow, this is interesting. I wonder whatever happened. If say he did have something, that he maybe just found it on a bazaar, at marketplace somewhere in the Middle East and brought it back. But if he had it, what happened to it? That whatever this thing was. And it turned out that one of his descendants, a man called Thomas Wright, who happened to be an historian in the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s, actually claimed to have still possessed this cup that his ancestor had found, that they believe was the Holy Grail, which certainly seemed to have started a lot of Holy Grail legends. So even if it had ever had anything to do with Jesus or Mary Magdalene, it certainly had started the legend of the Grail in the Middle Ages. This guy claimed to have still had it, but because he had no children to hand it on to, he hid it before he died and left his own clues as to where it was. So that was a fascinating story, that was.
Yeah, it was, certainly was. You also wrote a book called The Marian Conspiracy, which kind of goes on from the Holy Grail, and it's about the real father of Christ and the tomb of the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, I'd started doing paranormal investigations, but by this time I was more doing historical.
Well, this is why I kind of labelled the show that you're kind of a historian, paranormal investigator. I think mostly.
Yeah, the thing about the Marian Conspiracy, or the Virgin Mary Conspiracy as it was published in America, is that this came on from, some people, I kept saying there was lots of different ideas to what the Holy Grail is, and some of them is that the Holy Grail was the bloodline of Jesus, and that's what Dan Brown says, that the Holy Grail is actually the bloodline of Jesus. Basically, the Holy Grail basically became anything to do with Jesus and his blood, I think, at the end. There could be many items. But the bloodline of Mary, Jesus' mother, some people basically believed that the Holy Grail was in fact represented the Virgin Mary, our sacred blood. That's another story and it gets a bit complicated. But the thing was that when I was investigating that as a spin-off from the Holy Grail, I became interested in finding out that today that the Catholic Church teaches that the Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother, like Jesus, ascended bodily into heaven. So there's no body on the earth to remain. You can't find her bones anywhere. But I found out that this became church doctrine in 1950, when the Pope at the time decided to make it so. Before that time, the Bible itself doesn't actually say what happens to the Virgin Mary. Jesus dies at the crucifixion, Mary's present, she's staying with a disciple in Jerusalem at the time who comforts her. We hear no more about her. We hear about the Acts of the Apostles. We hear about what Peter and all the other the disciples do, and then St. Paul and so forth. We don't hear anything else about Mary. We don't know what she does. She's not important, it seems, enough after Jesus' death to be included in the Bible, as far as the Bible authors are concerned. But early traditions grew up in the Christian tradition, that Mary had in fact, there was actually three separate stories grew up. There was no actually unified Catholic Church until the Romans made it so in 325 AD. So for a good few hundred years, the church was divided into lots of different local Christian groups. And they had different stories grew up. Some people didn't think the Virgin Mary was unimportant, other than, not important after Jesus' death anyway. She didn't do anything else. But some said that she was buried in a tomb in Jerusalem's Valley of Jehoshaphat. Others said she went with the disciple John, if I remember right. Was it Thomas? No, John, to Ephesus in what's now Turkey, a Roman city, and she died and was buried there. Others said that she'd, but another story grew up that she'd actually, she'd died and then went on upon, no, she didn't die, she ascended bodily to heaven. In some of the stories she died and then a body ascended to heaven and came back to life. In others, she just never died, she ascended to heaven. So all these different stories grew up. And until 1950, it was pretty much up to the mind of the individual churchgoer to decide what they believed about what happened to Mary. It wasn't it wasn't written in church law that she ascended bodily to heaven or that she was buried in the Valley of Jehoshaphat or wherever. But once the Pope actually said in 1950, right, that's it, you all have to believe the Virgin Mary ascended bodily to heaven, then it gave a problem to these people, these Catholics who ran this shrine at the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Jerusalem, and making money out of showing people the body of the Virgin Mary, and they had been for centuries, or showing them the tomb. He basically said this is a fake, so what did they do with it?
Okay, right. We are at that point where the glitch happened. Unfortunately, Graham was carrying on talking to me, but unfortunately the recording decided to stop. So we ended up with the conversation with me and Graham, but unfortunately no recording. So what happened, I don't quite know. Sometimes these things happen. But I got around that because actually it's quite a bonus for you, because what I've actually got is a recording of Graham talking about the green stone in great detail, which is basically what he was talking about with me, but in not so much detail. And also you'll hear some other voices on the recording that he mentions he's talking about. So I think you'll find this quite a suitable replacement to end the show with. Luckily it was round about the time when it just finished doing the main talk anyway. You might have missed a few words off of it, but I ended up, as I finished the show, I asked Graham had he had any more paranormal experiences, and really he started telling me about the experiences that happened at the studio, and where they used to produce the magazine. And really this is what the Greenstone story tells you about. You'll hear about the really weird occurrences. So I hope you'll forgive the fact that we lost a recording, but I think you'll find this is quite a suitable replacement for it. I hope so anyway. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So here we are. Graham Phillips talks about the green stone.
1980, Central England, an abandoned Victorian house. Walls crumble, floors rot, and ceilings collapse. Not over years, but weeks. Here, a building is inexplicably falling apart, as is the fabric of reality itself. The occupants have fled, forced out by mysterious accidents, unexplained noises, terrifying apparitions, and objects that unaccountably move by themselves. But this is no haunted house. Here, events from the past, the future, and alternative versions of the present are merging as one. Can it be stopped, or even contained? What if it can't? This is no supernatural or science fiction tale. Attested to by dozens of witnesses, unfortunately, this story is true. Taken from my book, The Green Stone, this is the story of how it all began. just the year before, in the summer of 1979, this same building, number 19 Oaks Crescent, in the town of Wolverhampton, had been the busy headquarters of the paranormal research group, Parasearch, and the offices of its monthly magazine, Strange Phenomena. At the time, I had been the magazine's editor, and the group's chief investigator was Andrew Collins. It started with a routine investigation we were conducting into a 16th century secret society thought to have been founded by the Elizabethan occultist and astrologer Dr. John Dee. Inspired by a new star, actually a supernova, which appeared in the constellation of Cygnus the Swan in 1572 and interpreted to herald a new age of enlightenment, the society, known as the Order of Meoniah, met here at Canons Ashby House in the Midlands of central England. This room, only recently rediscovered, was its clandestine meeting chamber. Upon its walls are the heraldic crests of those who gathered here in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Unusually for the period of the Reformation, they include important figures from both sides of the religious divide, such as the Protestant statesman and explorer Sir Walter Raleigh and the Catholic activist Robert Catesby. Legend held that the order possessed a sacred green gemstone thought to have strange supernatural powers, which once belonged to the deposed monarch, Mary Queen of Scots. Following the abortive gunpowder plot to assassinate the new king, James I, in 1605, which had been led by Robert Catesby, the Order of Meoniah disbanded, and the stone was supposedly hidden in a secret location by another member of the group, Humphrey Packington, where it had remained for 4 centuries. Packington, however, was said to have left clues to lead to the stone's whereabouts, hidden somewhere in his home at Harvington Hall, near the Midland town of Kidderminster. Andrew and I decided to visit this old Tudor house to see what we could discover. It was then that events took a strange turn. No one else knew of our investigation, but others in the Parasearch team began to experience what can only be described as psychic impressions. Psychical researcher Terry Shotton was interviewed in 1981.
During the many years of research, one of the people we'd investigated, and who proved to be a very good psychic, was a lady by the name of Miss Penny Blackwell. One evening I got a phone call from Penny asking if I would go down to see her as soon as possible. I got down to Penny's about an hour later, and she took out a tape and explained that for the very first time she had decided to tape herself in a trance. She played the tape, and on the tape she first of all starts to talk in quite a normal voice. Suddenly her voice changes and it starts to talk about Parasearch, the people involved with Parasearch, and a project that we were about to embark on, and that it would have quite major repercussions in the future. This was quite strange to me because I hadn't got a clue what on earth she was talking about. It just seemed to be absolutely ridiculous. I gave no more thought to it directly until the following day. I then got a phone call from Alan.
Alan Beard was a family friend of the Shottons who knew absolutely nothing about our investigation into a lost green stone. He too was interviewed about this phone call in 1981.
And while I was speaking to him, quite unexpectedly, I had the impression, a vision if you like, of a white object floating through space towards me. It kept on coming towards me and shrank again in size. This was something strange because I've never had anything like this happen to me before, images or impressions. It came totally out of the blue. The final impression I had of it was that it was coming towards me, shrinking in size. The smallest it was when it stopped in front of me. and it was the size and impression of a green stone mounted on an old silver ring.
Andrew and I were astonished to hear of Alan Beard's vision. Was it a remarkable coincidence? Some kind of telepathy? Or was the legend true? That a sacred green stone really did await discovery? Andrew and I decided to visit Harvington Hall, the place where it was said the clues to lead to the whereabouts of the green stone had been hidden. When we arrived, we were in for yet another surprise. We discovered that during recent renovations to the building, a mysterious mural was found on the wall of an upstairs corridor. It had been painted during Humphrey Packington's time and deliberately sealed up behind wood panelling since the early 1600s. Known as the Nine Werthers, as it depicted 9 heroic characters from history and legend, might this old wall mural hold the clues said to lead to the whereabouts of the stone? We examined the painting, ultimately concluding that the central image was of crucial importance. It depicted a youthful King Arthur wielding Excalibur, and behind him his knights were gathered on a hill. Remarkably, this seemed to relate to a location in the surrounding landscape. Nearby, there was a hill called Knight's Hill, and below it, there were 2 lakes connected by a stream, over which there was an old footbridge dating from Packington's time. It was known locally as Arthur's Bridge. But even as Andrew and I prepared to visit the site, again having told no one of our latest findings, someone else known to the Parasearch team experienced a strange lucid dream she felt compelled to phone and tell us about. Marion Sunderland was interviewed in 1981.
I had a psychic impression myself, and I could see water, what appeared to be a very still lake.
But Marion was not the only one to call the Parasearch office, having no idea what we were doing. Alan Beard.
I decided that I would sit down with a pad, a writing pad and a pen, in the dining room at home, to see if I could get any more impressions of where we might look to find this green stone. No impressions came, but I did hear somebody, a voice perhaps, try to dictate something behind my head. It was as if I was listening to snatches of a conversation. The snatches that I heard gave reference to a holly bush. But the more important thing was that we weren't looking for a stone, we were looking for a sword that would lead us to the stone.
Marion had no idea we were about to visit a lake, and Alan had no idea our search involved a sword. The sword wielded by Arthur in the Nine Werthers mural. Andrew and I recently returned to the site to recall the eventful day of 40 years ago.
So we came here almost immediately. We knew anything about the site. And we hadn't told anybody. We hadn't told Alan Beard, or hadn't told Terry Shotton, or anybody. We hadn't told Marion.
But just before we set off, of course, as you mentioned, Alan Beard said you're actually looking for a sword at this point.
And that the sword would lead us to the stone.
Astonishingly, Marion had also seen a sword in her dream and was convinced she knew where it was.
I saw a large slab of stone. Resting on the slab of stone was a sword. And with that, I got an intense, overwhelming smell of rotting, decaying vegetation. It was very unpleasant.
So now we're even more certain that there's a link with King Arthur's Excalibur. What Alan Beard also said was that he keeps seeing a holly bush, and as we will see when we go round to the bridge, there is a holly bush right next to it, and I presume it's still there today. It was very big. That's where we went back to, and that's where we're going to go now.
The holly bush, we discovered, is no longer there, but it was captured on film taken in 1979.
picture of King Arthur wielding Excalibur in the Nine Werthers painting. He is actually standing there, as you look at him, he's looking down and to his left. And if you stood on the bridge and looked down onto the left, that's where you'd end up. And the knights on the hill gathered behind him are to his left. That's true. And that's Knight's Hill.
Yeah. And we then focused our attention on the other side of the bridge facing out onto the lake. The stone blocks that you see here, nicely stacked. There was something similar on the other side that was absolutely perfect. It was actually higher than this.
Since 1979, because of the publicity later surrounding our search, treasure hunters have virtually demolished the other side of the bridge. But behind which stone were we to look?
Ultimately settled on 9 stones along, 9 down.
That's it.
Because 9 was alluded to
Had
in the
been
Nine
the prominent
Werthers.
number associated with the Nine Werthers. It had also been...
For the first time in years, Andrew makes his way down to the overgrown location we'd decided to search.
Maybe it's behind the 9th stone along and down from the bridge. So 9 stones along and 9 stones down. And we eventually got down to the 9th layer and the 9th stone along from the bridge. And when we removed that stone, which would be impossible to remove and covered with brambles beforehand, we saw an alcove, a small recess area
Behind the stone.
and the torch, as it was shone inside, we could see that there was something long, thick inside it. And we didn't dare think at that moment as to what it was, but already the excitement was rising because it was quite clear that this was the blade of a sword. And that's exactly what we were told we'd find. A sword that would lead us to the green stone.
Not only had we solved a 400-year-old cryptic message, incredibly, Marion had said we would find a sword on a stone slab where there was a bad smell of rotting vegetation. She was right on both counts, and Alan Beard had told us a holly bush stood nearby. The holly bush was directly above us. Lying on top of the stone slab in the concealed alcove was a short sword or long dagger. Heavily encrusted with years of sediment, the item was around 20 inches long with a 2-inch crossguard. It was examined by experts at the Grosvenor Museum in the city of Chester and found to have been made from a single casting of steel. Identified as a dirk, a 16th century short ornamental Scottish sword, its crossguard was embossed with the personal monogram of the very person who was said to have once possessed the green stone, Mary Queen of Scots. Having been found on his estate, the sword was taken to the Earl of Coventry, who later gave it to the nearby Tudor House Museum in the town of Upton-upon-Severn, where it is now on public display. By an astonishing coincidence, in 1593, the museum building had been the home of Dr. John Dee, when he had been a clergyman working at the church right across the street. John Dee was believed to have been the man who founded the Order of Nehemiah, the very people who seemed to have hidden the sword. Any doubt that the sword had indeed belonged to this secret society was dispelled by an inscription along its blade, 3 words in Elizabethan spelling: Nehemiah for Mary. Ultimately, the sword did lead us to find the stone, just as Alan Beard had said. It is a long story, too long to be told here, but the clues concerned a second star that appeared in the constellation of Cygnus the Swan in the year 1600. Recorded at the time by the astronomer Johann Kepler, it was in fact the rare brightening of an existing star not previously visible with the naked eye, and it appeared in the Swan's neck. Near the bridge where the sword was found, there was a meander in the River Avon called the Swan's Neck, and it was here, from a grassy mound, that a brass casket was unearthed. The Grosvenor Museum dated it to the mid to late 16th century, and inside was a small green stone, fashioned from simple jade. We no longer have the casket and stone, but this rare footage was taken shortly after the discovery. We were all amazed by what we'd discovered, but none more so than Alan Beard.
The first time I saw the green stone was on the evening it was found. And I couldn't believe it, that there it was, the same small green stone that I had seen in a psychic vision weeks before.
As astonishing as it had all been, no one was prepared for what followed once the stone was taken to the Parasearch office. It began with strange electrical anomalies. In 1981, I recalled how it started.
The light bulbs were blowing far more frequently than we should be expecting. We investigated that and we couldn't seem to find anything to account for it. Then we started to receive electric shocks from the various appliances in the house. So, thinking that there was some major fault in the wiring system, we called in the local electricity board, who investigated, and they were quite baffled because they said that in their opinion something was drawing electricity off this wiring system of the Oaks Crescent headquarters.
Then it got stranger. Each evening, just as it got dark, a thick grey smoke filled the entire building, even in closets and behind closed doors. It cleared after a few minutes, and no sign of a fire or burning could be discovered. Unbelievably, it occurred each day around the same time. The whole place was repeatedly searched, but no explanation could be found. The electric company was again called in to check the wiring, but found nothing amiss. Not only the Parasearch team, but visitors to the office witnessed the weird anomalies, attracting the interest of local TV news, who came to film the events and interview staff. Nearly all had experienced appliances fusing, lights dimming, or had received inexplicable electric shocks, and the bizarre smoke continued to appear. Everyone was mystified. It all became too much when Andrew Collins slept over at the office after working late. He awoke in the middle of the night to find flames leaping from his sleeping bag. No explanation for the fire could be found, but he'd had a lucky escape. After that, no one wanted to work at the Parasearch headquarters. In fact, all work ceased and the building was abandoned after the electricity in the place failed altogether, leaving engineers baffled. Martin Keatman, a student at the time working with the magazine, was the first to witness a frightening new level of unexplained phenomena when he was helping to clear the building. He was interviewed a couple of years later.
I was alone in the front room of the headquarters, and he was out back somewhere, when something rather strange happened. My attention was suddenly drawn, that's the only word I can think of to use, to the mantelpiece above the fireplace, and in the middle a radio belonging to Andy Collins, which quite inexplicably and to me absolutely amazingly suddenly lifted into the air to crash down onto the record player and smash the lid irreparably.
This was just the first of such disturbing events. Removal men were dumbstruck on seeing office furniture moving around. Others witnessed doors opening and slamming shut. Some members of the parasearch team even refused to re-enter the place, having items thrown at them, as if by unseen hands. Most of us, however, were excited at the prospect of having what seemed to be a poltergeist case occurring so close to home. With a year remaining on the lease, we continued to visit the empty house, sometimes staying overnight. With the power out, the rambling old building was illuminated only by flashlights and candles. Strange noises were heard. Banging sounds, whispering voices, eerie distant singing. And inexplicable things were seen, crimson balls of light and a luminous floating mist. A coin on the floor suddenly became red hot and melted into the carpet. And on one occasion, a blue, gelatinous substance began oozing from the walls. Ultimately, the apparitions appeared. A ghostly dark figure in Victorian clothes. A woman in contemporary attire. And, most astonishing of all, what, for all the world, looked like an ancient Egyptian princess. Over a period of just a few months, the house began to collapse from within. Plaster fell from the walls, the floors began to rot, pipes rusted and burst. It was almost as if time inside the building was passing at an accelerated rate. What was causing all this? We reasoned that perhaps the various paranormal experiments that we'd conducted here had somehow initiated these bizarre events. Eventually, Marion Sunderland had what she described as a psychic impression, revealing that the activity had been caused by the green stone. Although it was no longer in the building, it had, she said, opened some kind of preternatural rift. And if something wasn't done, the phenomena would spread beyond the confines of the Oaks Crescent house. But she knew how it could be stopped.
I felt somehow that the stone was perhaps responsible for attracting or causing some of the incredible phenomena that had taken place and the disturbances. Also at this time, I had a strong impression that if we could somehow discharge the power of the stone, or at least neutralize it for the time being, that this would help matters quite considerably. I thought and felt very deeply that the stone itself should be taken to venerated ground.
We took the stone to a ruined monastic building near Wolverhampton, White Ladies Priory, where some of the team believed the relic had been made.
When we got there, we took the stone to what we discovered was an ancient burial mound lying about 50 yards from the priory, surrounded by trees. I felt that there was something very powerful going to take place at 9:30. And under the circumstances, I thought it would be much the best thing to retreat to the safety of the priory, to wait, and to see what took place.
The 9 of us who were present that evening left the wood and retreated to within the walls of the priory, as Marion suggested. Even after all we'd already witnessed, no one was prepared for what followed, once it grew dark. One of those present was local horticultural officer Mike Ratcliffe. He was interviewed in 1981.
Once we're within the grounds of the priory and actually inside the walls, the kind of the most eerie screeches from the woodland area where the stone had been placed. These are certainly not made by anything in the natural world that I know of. Certainly no birds or animals ever made noises like those. And then after a short period of time in the sky, again in the area of the woodland where the stone had been placed, became sort of 5 brilliant flashes. These came in fairly quick succession, but spread over an area, as I say, in the sort of the woodland area, and they were certainly brighter than anything that I had seen sort of man-made, so to speak. Really sort of brilliant. They lit up the whole of the area around about.
5 spheres of brilliant white light floated silently in the air before merging as one, moving towards us and exploding with a blinding flash and an ear-shattering bang.
When these lights exploded and the light from the balls of light lit up all the surrounding areas, we all started to make a dash back for the cars. I kept looking, as we ran across back to the cars, I kept looking back towards the trees to see whether I could see anything that could have possibly have been the cause, but it was nothing. It was just all blackness, as if nothing had occurred. We got back into the cars. I was quite shaken. I think everyone else was. And we just got away from the place as quickly as possible.
There is much more to this story, told not only in The Green Stone, but in Andrew Collins' book, The Seventh Sword, published in 1991. The Wolverhampton building remained abandoned for years before being sold and converted into apartments. As far as I know, it is now a quiet, ordinary house. What I've covered might seem far-fetched, but if anything, I have played down the astonishing events that occurred 40 years ago, as you will discover if you read this special 40th anniversary edition of The Green Stone.
So, how about that? Very interesting. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a replacement because we lost, as I mentioned earlier, we lost the end of the recording with Graham. Anyway, Graham, if you're listening, I do apologise, but we lost the end of your recording. Thank you for letting us use that piece of recording, which was very interesting anyway, and kind of went into a lot more detail than we had time for. So it kind of made a really good replacement, and excellent. I really enjoyed listening to it again. Anyway, right, we'll leave it there then, and thank you for listening. Let's hope we don't have any more glitches next week, and I hope you'll join us. You've been listening to Paranormal Dimensions on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm David Young, and thank you for listening. Thank you, Graham, again, and thank you and goodbye.
Paranormal Dimensions is as bright and powerful as our celestial star, the sun. And although it's expending thousands of pounds of energy every minute of the day, have no fear. There's plenty left.
Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.